Hey, mister. Wait. The sharp voice cut through the bustling crowd of New Yorkers, pushing past each other under the heavy glow of streetlights. Jonathan Miller, head down, hands shoved into the pockets of his tailored coat, ignored it. People asking for handouts were as common as car horns in the city, and tonight, of all nights, he wasn't in the mood for anyone's problems. Papa. The word hit him like a slap. Jonathan froze mid-step. Turning, his eyes landed on a small figure bundled in a threadbare coat, 2 sizes too big. She couldn't have been more than 8 years old, her face smudged with dirt, her thin hair barely visible beneath a crooked knit cap. Her gloveless hand clutched a crumpled envelope. "Who are you talking to?" he asked, his voice sharper than he intended. "You," she replied, her tone firm but hopeful. "Merry Christmas, Papa." She thrust the envelope toward him. Jonathan blinked, caught off guard by her boldness. "I'm not your father," he snapped, stepping back. "I know." The matter-of-factness in her voice surprised him. "But I need you to read this, please." He glanced at the envelope, then at the girl, trying to decipher if this was some kind of scam. The crowd surged around them, brushing against him impatiently as he stood motionless. The envelope dangled from her hand, shaking slightly in the cold. "Take it," she insisted. "It's important." "Look, kid, I don't—" "Just read it," she pleaded, her voice cracking. "Please. That's all I'm asking." Something in her eyes, a mix of desperation and defiance, made him relent. Against his better judgment, Jonathan reached for the envelope. The girl's shoulders relaxed a fraction, but she didn't smile. Before he could say anything, she turned on her heel and disappeared into the crowd. He stared after her, bewildered, then looked down at the envelope in his hand. Written in large, uneven letters were the words, "To my dad, whoever you are." A lump formed in his throat, but he shook it off, stuffing the envelope into his pocket. Later that night, in the solitude of his penthouse apartment, Jonathan sat on the edge of his expensive leather couch, the city skyline glittering through the floor-to-ceiling windows behind him. He pulled the envelope from his coat. It was wrinkled and slightly damp from the snow, but the words stared back at him, daring him to open it. Sighing, he tore it open and unfolded the single piece of lined notebook paper inside. The handwriting was jagged and uneven, but legible. "Dear Dad, I don't know who you are, but I'm writing this because maybe you'll find me. My name is Sarah, and I'm 8. I live in a shelter, but I don't like it there. Everyone says families are supposed to be together for Christmas, but I don't have one. Can you be my dad? Even just for a little while? Please? I promise I'm not hard to take care of. I don't need a lot, just someone who cares. Merry Christmas. Love, Sarah." Jonathan's hands tightened around the letter as he read it again and then again. His chest felt heavy, and he leaned forward, trying to shake off the growing unease. He didn't know this kid, and he had no idea why she'd singled him out. Was this a coincidence, or had someone orchestrated this? He didn't like it. He crumpled the letter in his fist, ready to throw it in the trash, but something stopped him. The words played over and over in his mind. "Can you be my dad?" It wasn't the kind of request a scammer would write. It was raw, too raw to be fake. But why him? Why now? He leaned back, closing his eyes as memories crept in unbidden. Memories of hospital rooms, hushed conversations with doctors, and the crushing realization that he and Emily would never have the family they dreamed of. His throat tightened. He shook his head, trying to banish the thoughts, but Sarah's face wouldn't leave his mind. Against his better judgment, Jonathan pulled out his phone and did a quick search. He typed in the only detail he had: Sarah, shelter, New York. Dozens of results popped up, most of them generic, but one caught his attention: Riverview Children's Shelter. He stared at the screen, debating. This wasn't his problem. He didn't owe this kid anything. But the memory of her trembling hand holding out that envelope wouldn't go away. Sighing, he grabbed his coat and headed for the door. The Riverview Children's Shelter wasn't far, but the neighborhood was a world away from the glossy skyscrapers and boutique-lined streets Jonathan called home. The building was old, its brick facade crumbling in places, and the faint smell of mildew hung in the air as he stepped inside. "Can I help you?" A tired-looking woman at the front desk raised an eyebrow as Jonathan approached. "I'm looking for a girl named Sarah," he said, keeping his tone neutral. "She gave me this." He held up the crumpled envelope. The woman's eyes narrowed. And you are? Just someone who wants to help. The woman didn't look convinced, but she nodded toward a room down the hall. She's probably in there with the others. But if you're here for handouts or publicity, save it. These kids don't need empty promises. Jonathan ignored the jab and made his way down the hall. The sound of laughter and shouting echoed from behind a partially open door. Inside, a group of children was playing a chaotic game of tag. He spotted Sarah immediately. She was sitting alone in the corner, her knees pulled to her chest, watching the other kids with a blank expression. He hesitated. What was he even doing here? This wasn't his world. He didn't know how to talk to kids, let alone help them. But then Sarah looked up and saw him. Her eyes widened in surprise, and for a moment, he thought she might bolt. Instead, she stood slowly and walked toward him, her expression unreadable. "You came," she said quietly. "I did," he replied, "but I'm not sure why." Sarah studied him for a long moment, then shrugged. "Most people don't come back." Her words stung more than they should have. Jonathan knelt slightly, meeting her gaze. "Why me?" he asked. "Why did you give me that letter?" Sarah hesitated, then said, "You looked like someone who needed it." Jonathan didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Instead, he just said, "Maybe I did." For the first time, Sarah smiled, small, hesitant, but real. And Jonathan knew his life was about to change. Jonathan sat in his car outside the shelter, the engine running and the heater humming softly. His hands gripped the steering wheel, and Sarah's words replayed in his mind. "You looked like someone who needed it." What did she mean by that? Was she trying to manipulate him? Or was there something deeper at play? He glanced at the crumpled letter on the passenger seat. For years, he'd worked to bury his emotions, locking them behind layers of business meetings, financial triumphs, and the cold distance of wealth. But this kid, this scrappy little girl with her unpolished honesty, had cracked open something he thought was long gone. He pulled out his phone and called his assistant, Mark. "Jonathan, it's Christmas Eve," Mark answered, his voice edged with a mix of exhaustion and irritation. "This better be important. I need you to find out everything you can about a kid named Sarah. She's staying at Riverview Children's Shelter in Midtown. About 8 years old. No last name yet, but I'll get it." Mark hesitated. "Are you serious? You want me to dig into some random kid on Christmas Eve?" "Just do it," Jonathan snapped. "And call me when you find something." Mark sighed. "Fine. I'll see what I can do. Merry Christmas to you, too." Jonathan hung up and leaned back in his seat. He stared out the windshield at the shelter's faded sign, debating whether to go back inside. But what would he say? That he was here to solve her problems? He didn't even know what she needed, much less how to help. The car felt too small, too suffocating. He grabbed the letter and stepped outside, the icy air hitting him like a slap. For a moment, he just stood there, staring at the shelter. Then he started walking. Inside, the shelter had quieted. Most of the kids were gone, likely to temporary foster homes or holiday programs. Only a few lingered, scattered across the worn-out furniture in the common room. Sarah was still there, sitting at a table with a puzzle spread out in front of her. She didn't look up when Jonathan approached. "Hey," he said, sliding into the chair across from her. Sarah glanced at him, her expression neutral. "You came back again." "Yeah, I guess I did." He set the letter on the table between them. "This thing's been messing with my head." Her lips twitched, almost a smile. "It's just words. You don't have to do anything about it." Jonathan leaned forward. "Then why give it to me? Out of everyone in this city, why pick me?" Sarah shrugged, her small hands idly rearranging puzzle pieces. "Because you stopped. Most people just keep walking." He didn't know how to respond to that. She said it like it was the most natural thing in the world, as if kindness was so rare it demanded attention. And maybe it did. "What's your story?" he asked finally. "How'd you end up here?" Sarah hesitated, her fingers stilling on a puzzle piece. For a moment, he thought she wouldn't answer. Then she said, "My mom died last year. We didn't have anywhere to go after that. The shelter took me in." "And your dad?" "Don't have one. Or maybe I do. I don't know." She shrugged again, her voice carefully neutral. "I guess that's why I wrote the letter. In case he's out there." Jonathan felt a pang of something. Guilt? Sympathy? He wasn't sure. "You don't think it's—" "I don't know. A little risky just handing it to a stranger?" Sarah looked up, meeting his eyes for the first time. It's not like I had a lot of options. Her words hit him harder than he expected. She wasn't being dramatic. She was just stating a fact. Jonathan leaned back, running a hand through his hair. And what if I hadn't come back? Then I'd have given it to someone else, she said simply. But you did. Later, Jonathan stood outside the shelter again, his breath visible in the freezing air. He checked his phone. Still no word from Mark. He needed answers, but not just about Sarah. About himself. Why was he here? What was he trying to prove? He thought about leaving, about going back to his empty apartment and his carefully curated life. But the idea made his chest ache. For years, he'd told himself he didn't need anyone. Now, standing here, he wasn't so sure. Back in his penthouse, Jonathan poured himself a glass of whiskey and stared at the city below. He couldn't shake the image of Sarah sitting alone at that puzzle, her eyes guarded but hopeful. She didn't belong in a place like that. No kid did. His phone buzzed. Mark's name lit up the screen. "Tell me you found something," Jonathan said, answering immediately. "I did," Mark replied. "It's not much, but it's something. Her full name is Sarah Jenkins. Her mom, Angela, passed away last December. Cancer. No known father on record. She's been in and out of Riverview since then. Apparently, no family came forward to claim her." Jonathan's grip tightened on the phone. "No one? Not a single relative? None. She's officially a ward of the state. And if I'm being honest, it doesn't look good for her. She's in the system, Jonathan. You know how that goes." He did. He'd read the headlines, heard the horror stories. Kids bouncing between foster homes, slipping through the cracks, growing up without stability or support. It wasn't right. Mark continued, "Look, I don't know what you're planning here, but this isn't your problem. You've got enough on your plate without." "I'll call you later," Jonathan interrupted, hanging up before Mark could finish. He stared at the whiskey in his hand, then set it down untouched. Sarah's words echoed in his mind again. Families are supposed to be together for Christmas. Jonathan didn't know if he could fix this, but for the first time in years, he felt like he had to try. Jonathan stood at the window of his penthouse, staring out at the city that had made him a millionaire. The Christmas lights sparkled below, a reminder of festivities he had ignored for years. But tonight, they felt different, less a celebration and more a challenge. Somewhere in that sprawling city, an 8-year-old girl was spending Christmas Eve alone, waiting for a miracle she probably didn't believe would come. His thoughts were interrupted by the sharp buzz of his phone. Mark was calling again. Jonathan sighed and answered, already bracing for his assistant's frustration. "Before you hang up on me," Mark started, "I need to say this. What exactly are you trying to do? Adopt her? Sponsor her? Because whatever this is, it's a terrible idea." "Thanks for the vote of confidence," Jonathan muttered. "I'm serious, Jonathan. You don't know this kid. You don't even like kids." Jonathan's jaw tightened. "I'm not making a decision tonight, but I need to do something." Mark exhaled loudly on the other end. "Fine. Just don't turn this into one of your projects. She's not a company you can fix with money." Jonathan didn't reply. He hung up, grabbed his coat, and headed for the door. He wasn't sure what he was doing, but he knew he couldn't stay still. The shelter was quieter than before. Most of the kids were asleep, their soft snores echoing through the worn-out hallways. Sarah was in the same spot, sitting cross-legged on the floor with her puzzle. She didn't look up when Jonathan entered. "You again," she said, her tone more curious than annoyed. "Me again," Jonathan replied, lowering himself onto the floor across from her. He noticed she was still wearing the same oversized coat, the edges fraying. "Don't you ever get tired of this puzzle?" "It's missing pieces," she said, holding up a jagged edge. "But it's something to do." He nodded, unsure of how to respond. For a moment, they sat in silence, the faint hum of the building filling the air. Finally, Jonathan spoke. "I talked to someone about you." Sarah's hands stilled. "What do you mean?" "I wanted to know more about you. Your mom. Your situation here." He hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. "I wanted to understand." Sarah's eyes narrowed. "Why?" "Because I think you deserve better than this." Her expression softened, but only slightly. "Lots of people think that. They just don't do anything about it." Jonathan felt the sting of her words. She was right, and he knew it. "I'm not like most people," he said finally. "Why do you care?" Sarah asked, her voice quiet. You don't even know me. Jonathan leaned back, his hands resting on his knees. I don't know. Maybe because I see something in you I don't see in a lot of people. Maybe because I wish someone had cared about me when I was a kid. Sarah tilted her head, studying him. You're not a kid anymore. No, he admitted. But that doesn't mean I can't help you. She didn't reply, but her gaze lingered on him a little longer this time. The next morning, Jonathan woke early and made his way back to the shelter, coffee in hand and a plan forming in his mind. He wasn't sure how far he could take this, but he knew one thing: Sarah needed stability. And maybe, just maybe, he could give her that. At the shelter's front desk, the same tired-looking woman from before gave him a skeptical look. You're back. I need to talk to someone about Sarah Jenkins, Jonathan said, his tone firm but polite. Who's in charge of her case? The woman raised an eyebrow. And you are? Someone who wants to help. She didn't look convinced, but she gestured toward a small office down the hall. Talk to Mrs. Avery. She handles most of the kids' cases. Jonathan nodded and made his way to the office. Mrs. Avery was a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a weary expression. She looked up from her desk as he entered. Can I help you? She asked. I'm here about Sarah Jenkins, Jonathan said, sitting down across from her. I want to know what her options are. Mrs. Avery frowned. Sarah's case is complicated. She's been here for almost a year, and no family members have come forward. She's eligible for foster care, but she's been through a few rough placements already. What about adoption? Jonathan asked. Mrs. Avery's eyes widened slightly. Are you considering adopting her? Jonathan hesitated. The word felt heavy, loaded with responsibility he wasn't sure he was ready for. I'm considering helping her, however I can. Mrs. Avery leaned forward, her hands clasped on the desk. Mr. Miller, I don't mean to discourage you, but adoption isn't a simple process. Sarah needs more than someone who feels sorry for her. She needs someone committed to being there for the long haul. Jonathan met her gaze, unflinching. I'm not making any promises yet, but I need to know what's possible. Mrs. Avery studied him for a long moment before nodding. I can get you the information you need, but if you're serious about this, you need to think carefully. Sarah's been let down before. She doesn't need that again. Jonathan's chest tightened. Neither do I, he said quietly. When Jonathan returned to the shelter's common room, Sarah was waiting for him. She stood with her arms crossed, her gaze sharp and curious. What are you doing? Talking to people, he replied. Trying to figure out what I can do for you. Her brow furrowed. Why? Because you deserve it, he said simply. She didn't say anything, but for the first time, he saw something in her eyes. A flicker of hope, hesitant and fragile. It was enough. The shelter's dim lights flickered as Sarah stared at Jonathan, her arms still crossed defensively. You talked to Mrs. Avery, didn't you? She asked. I did, Jonathan admitted, keeping his voice steady. I needed to know more about what you're going through. Her eyes narrowed. You're not going to be one of those people who promises things and then disappears, right? The question hung in the air like a challenge, cutting through Jonathan's carefully composed demeanor. He knelt slightly to meet her gaze, realizing that any answer short of the truth would shatter what little trust she'd extended. I don't know what I'm promising yet, he said honestly, but I'm here, and I'm not walking away. Sarah's gaze softened slightly, but the wall she'd built around herself remained firmly in place. Okay, she said finally, as if giving him the benefit of the doubt for now. But if you lie to me, I won't forgive you. Jonathan nodded. Deal. The next day, Jonathan sat in his office at Miller Enterprises. A view of Manhattan sprawled out behind him. Normally, his mornings were consumed by meetings, reports, and the endless pursuit of more success. But today, his thoughts were elsewhere. Mark stepped in, holding a stack of documents. Here's the info you asked for on Riverview and Sarah's case. I've also flagged some resources if you're thinking about moving forward. Jonathan took the folder, but didn't open it immediately. Mark hesitated, then said, Look, I know you think this is a noble cause, but are you sure you're up for it? You don't do things halfway, Jonathan. If you get involved, this won't just be some temporary gesture. I know, Jonathan replied, his voice firm. This isn't temporary, Mark sighed, running a hand through his hair. All right, just be careful. Kids like Sarah, they've been through a lot. You can't fix everything. Jonathan finally opened the folder, scanning the sparse details about Sarah's life. Born to Angela Jenkins, a single mother who'd worked 2 jobs to make ends meet. No father listed. Bounced between shelters and short-term foster homes after Angela's death. Declared a ward of the state 6 months ago. The more he read, the heavier the weight in his chest grew. Sarah had spent her short life fighting for stability, something Jonathan had taken for granted in his youth before success consumed him. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had everything money could buy, but she had the one thing he lacked: resilience. That evening, Jonathan returned to Riverview with a duffel bag in hand. The shelter's director, Mrs. Avery, met him at the door, her expression wary but curious. "What brings you back so soon?" she asked. "I wanted to drop these off for Sarah," he said, handing her the bag. Inside were clothes, a winter coat, and a pair of sturdy boots, essentials that he'd noticed she lacked. "It's not much, but it's a start." Mrs. Avery nodded, her skepticism softening. "She could use it. But if I may offer some advice, Mr. Miller, Sarah doesn't trust easily. She's been let down too many times. If you're serious about helping her, you'll need to be patient." "I understand," Jonathan said, though he wasn't sure if he truly did. Mrs. Avery sighed. "Well, she's in the common room. I'll let her know you're here." When Jonathan walked into the room, Sarah was sitting on a frayed couch, flipping through an old book. She glanced up and frowned when she saw him. "What are you doing here?" "I brought you something," he said, holding up the duffel bag. "Just a few things I thought you might need." Sarah eyed the bag suspiciously, then reached for it. She unzipped it slowly, pulling out the items one by one. Her fingers lingered on the coat, tracing the soft fabric. "Why are you doing this?" she asked without looking at him. "Because I can," Jonathan replied. "And because you deserve it." Sarah set the coat aside, her expression unreadable. "Thanks," she said quietly, though the word carried more weight than its simplicity suggested. "You're welcome," Jonathan said, feeling an unexpected warmth in her acknowledgement. Over the next few weeks, Jonathan made a habit of visiting Riverview. Sometimes he brought practical things, school supplies, warm meals, books. Other times, he just sat with Sarah, letting her talk if she wanted to, or sitting in comfortable silence when she didn't. Slowly, the walls she'd built around herself began to crack. She started asking him questions about his life, his work, his past. He answered honestly, even when the answers revealed parts of himself he wasn't proud of. "Why don't you have kids?" she asked one afternoon as they worked on a new puzzle together. Jonathan hesitated. "I wanted to," he admitted, "but it didn't work out." Sarah tilted her head, studying him. "Because of your wife?" Jonathan's chest tightened. "Yeah. Do you miss her?" "Every day." Sarah nodded, as if filing the information away. "She'd probably like that you're helping me." The simplicity of her statement caught him off guard. "Maybe," he said, his voice quieter than usual. One evening, as Jonathan was leaving, Sarah stopped him at the door. "Are you coming back tomorrow?" she asked. He smiled. "Do you want me to?" Sarah shrugged, but there was a glimmer of something vulnerable in her eyes. "I guess." Jonathan nodded. "Then I'll be here." As he walked to his car, he realized something had shifted. This wasn't just about helping Sarah anymore. It was about something deeper, something he couldn't quite put into words but felt in every step he took away from the shelter. For the first time in years, he felt like he had a purpose, and he wasn't going to let it slip away. The following week, Jonathan's visits to Riverview became a routine. Sarah's guard was still up, but it was lowering bit by bit, her occasional smiles and candid questions hinting at the trust slowly building between them. Jonathan felt himself adjusting to this unfamiliar role, learning to navigate the delicate balance of being there for her without overstepping. One evening, as they sat together in the common room, Sarah asked a question that stopped him cold. "What were you like when you were my age?" Jonathan leaned back in his chair, the corners of his mouth twitching into an unplanned smile. "Troublemaker," he admitted. "I got into everything I wasn't supposed to." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Like what?" "Like skipping school to go to Yankees games, or sneaking into places I shouldn't have been. Let's just say my parents had their hands full." "You had parents?" Sarah's tone wasn't accusatory, but it carried a quiet curiosity that caught him off guard. "Yeah," Jonathan said carefully. "They worked hard to give me a good life. I didn't appreciate it enough back then." Sarah shrugged, her attention drifting back to the puzzle they were working on. Must have been nice to have someone. Jonathan's chest tightened. He wanted to say something that would ease the weight behind her words, but he didn't know how. Instead, he asked, "What about you? What's the best memory you have with your mom?" Sarah hesitated, her fingers playing with the edge of a puzzle piece. "She used to sing to me," she said finally, "before bed, when she wasn't too tired. She had this one song she always sang, 'You Are My Sunshine.'" Her voice dropped as she added, "She said it was our song." Jonathan nodded, unsure if he could trust himself to speak. The image of Sarah's mother, tired but loving, lingered in his mind. He made a mental note to find out more about her when he left the shelter that night. Back at his penthouse, Jonathan pored over the sparse details Mark had compiled on Angela Jenkins. She'd grown up in the Bronx, graduated high school but never attended college, and had worked as a waitress at 2 different diners before her death. There were no obvious connections between Angela and Jonathan's world. No shared acquaintances, no intersecting paths. But something about her story nagged at him. Jonathan couldn't explain it, but he felt as though there was more to uncover. The fact that Sarah had no recorded father on her birth certificate only deepened his curiosity. The next morning, Jonathan called Mark. "I need you to dig deeper into Angela Jenkins," he said. "Her family, her friends, anyone who might know more about her and Sarah." Mark sighed audibly. "Jonathan, this is starting to feel like an obsession." "Just do it," Jonathan insisted. "I'll owe you one." Mark muttered something under his breath, but he agreed. "I'll see what I can find. Don't expect miracles." A few days later, Mark called back with news. "I found something," he said. "It's not much, but it might interest you." Jonathan leaned forward at his desk, his heart beating faster. "What is it?" Angela Jenkins used to work at a diner in the Bronx called Daisy's. She was close with a woman named Linda Parker, co-workers, maybe friends. "Linda still works there." Jonathan didn't hesitate. He grabbed his coat and was out the door before Mark could finish his sentence. Daisy's diner was a modest place, its neon sign flickering against the cold morning sky. Jonathan stepped inside, the smell of coffee and frying bacon greeting him. A few customers sat in booths, but his attention went immediately to the counter, where a middle-aged woman in a faded uniform was pouring coffee. "Linda Parker?" he asked, approaching her. She looked up, her expression wary. "Who's asking?" "My name's Jonathan Miller," he said. "I'm trying to learn more about Angela Jenkins and her daughter, Sarah." Linda's face softened at the mention of Angela's name. "Angela? It's been a long time. She was a good woman." She glanced around the diner before gesturing for Jonathan to sit. "What do you want to know?" "Anything you can tell me," Jonathan said. "Her life, her struggles. Anything that might help me understand her and Sarah better." Linda sighed, taking a seat across from him. Angela had it rough. She was a single mom, working 2 jobs just to keep a roof over their heads. But no matter how tired she was, she always put Sarah first. That little girl was her world. "What about Sarah's father?" Jonathan asked. "Do you know anything about him?" Linda's expression darkened. "Angela never talked about him much. All I know is he left before Sarah was born. She didn't even put his name on the birth certificate. Said he wasn't worth the ink." Jonathan frowned. "No name? Nothing?" Linda shook her head. Angela didn't dwell on the past. She was focused on giving Sarah a future. But after the cancer diagnosis, her voice trailed off and she looked away. Jonathan waited, sensing there was more. "She didn't want Sarah to know how bad it was," Linda said finally. "She kept working as long as she could. When she couldn't anymore, she made sure Sarah got into the shelter. Said it was better than leaving her with nothing." Jonathan's chest tightened. Angela's sacrifices painted a picture of a woman who had done everything in her power to protect her daughter, even at the cost of her own health. "Thank you," he said, standing. "This helps more than you know." Linda gave him a sad smile. "If you're trying to help Sarah, don't let her down. Angela wouldn't forgive you for that." That evening, Jonathan returned to Riverview, his mind still reeling from what he'd learned. Sarah was waiting for him in the common room, her usual puzzle set out in front of her. "You're late," she said without looking up. "Had a busy day," Jonathan replied, taking a seat beside her. Sarah glanced at him, her eyes narrowing slightly. "You're hiding something," Jonathan chuckled. "You're too smart for your own good. You know that?" She shrugged, her fingers moving pieces into place. "So what is it?" Jonathan hesitated. He didn't want to overwhelm her, but he also didn't want to lie. "I've been learning more about your mom," he said finally. "About what she went through to take care of you." Sarah froze, her hand hovering over the puzzle. "Why?" "Because it matters," Jonathan said gently. "She worked hard to make sure you were okay, even when things got tough. That's important to know." Sarah didn't respond right away, her expression unreadable. Finally, she said, "She was the best mom. Even when we didn't have anything, she made me feel like we had everything." Jonathan nodded, his throat tight. "You're a lot like her, you know." Sarah looked up at him, her eyes wide and vulnerable. For the first time, Jonathan saw the depth of her pain and her strength, two sides of the same coin. "Thanks," she said softly, and he knew it was more than gratitude. It was trust. Jonathan stood at the edge of the shelter's common room, watching Sarah as she sat among a small group of other kids, her sharp focus on a game of checkers. Her opponent, a boy around her age, was fidgeting nervously while Sarah made deliberate, confident moves. She didn't notice Jonathan, and for a moment, he hesitated to approach. There was something in her intensity, her ability to block out the noise of the world, that reminded him of himself. When Sarah finally spotted him, her expression flickered with something between surprise and relief. She abandoned the game without hesitation, leaving the boy mid-grumble, and walked over to him. "You're here again," she said, her tone as matter-of-fact as always. "Of course I'm here," Jonathan replied, crouching slightly to meet her gaze. "I told you I wasn't going anywhere." "People say that," Sarah muttered, her voice quieter now, "but they always leave." Jonathan felt the sting of her words, the sharpness of a truth she had lived through too many times. "Well," he said, keeping his voice firm, "I'm not like most people." She tilted her head, studying him like she was trying to decide if she believed him. "You better not be," she said finally, her tone both serious and teasing. "Do you trust me yet?" he asked, half joking. Sarah smirked. "Not even close." Later that night, Jonathan sat in his penthouse, the city lights glowing faintly through the windows. He pored over the details Mark had unearthed about Angela Jenkins, replaying Linda Parker's words in his head. She always put Sarah first. It was clear that Angela had been a fighter, a woman who'd faced impossible odds and refused to give up. Jonathan couldn't shake the feeling that he needed to do more. The visits to the shelter, the small acts of kindness, they weren't enough. Sarah needed stability, a future, and most of all, a family. But could he really be that for her? He'd spent so many years avoiding attachments, convincing himself he was better off alone. Was he ready to upend his life for a girl he barely knew? His phone buzzed on the table, interrupting his thoughts. It was Mark. "Didn't expect to hear from you tonight," Jonathan said, picking up. "I wasn't going to call, but I found something else," Mark replied. His tone was hesitant, almost reluctant. "It's about Angela." Jonathan straightened. "What is it?" "She had some medical debt," Mark said. "A lot of it. The kind that makes you wonder how she was able to afford even the basics for Sarah." Jonathan frowned. "How much are we talking?" "Close to 50 grand, Mark said. "And here's the kicker. She paid most of it off before she died." Jonathan leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. "How?" "She was working 2 minimum wage jobs." "That's what I've been trying to figure out," Mark said. "There's no record of loans or government assistance. It's like the money just appeared." Jonathan's grip on the phone tightened. "Keep digging. I need to know where that money came from." Mark sighed. "I'll see what I can do. But Jonathan, don't get too deep into this. You can't change the past." "I'm not trying to change the past," Jonathan said firmly. "I'm trying to understand it." The next day, Jonathan arrived at the shelter with a plan. He didn't want to overwhelm Sarah, but he needed her to understand that he was serious about being in her life. He found her in the corner of the common room, flipping through a battered book. "Hey," he said, sitting beside her. Sarah glanced up. "You're back." "Again." "Get used to it," Jonathan said with a small smile. "I wanted to talk to you about something." Sarah closed the book, her expression guarded. "What?" "I've been thinking a lot about your mom," he began. "About everything she did to take care of you." Sarah's eyes darkened slightly, but she didn't interrupt. "She worked harder than anyone should ever have to," Jonathan continued. "And she made a lot of sacrifices to make sure you were okay. I want to honor that." Sarah frowned. "What do you mean?" Jonathan hesitated, searching for the right words. I want to help you, he said finally. Not just with clothes or books or visits. I want to make sure you have a real home. A place where you don't have to worry about what's next. Sarah's expression was unreadable, her small hands clutching the edges of her book. Are you saying you want to adopt me? Jonathan's throat tightened. He hadn't planned to say it outright, but the question hung in the air, demanding an answer. If you'll have me, he said quietly, if that's something you'd want. For a long moment, Sarah didn't respond. Then she said, why would you do that? Because you deserve it, Jonathan replied. Because your mom gave everything to make sure you had a chance, and I want to make sure her sacrifices weren't in vain. Sarah's gaze dropped to her lap. What if you change your mind? I won't, Jonathan said firmly, but I'll give you as much time as you need to believe that. She nodded slowly, her fingers tightening around the book. Okay, she said finally, but I'm not calling you Dad. Jonathan laughed softly. Fair enough. That night, Jonathan called Mark again. I need you to start the paperwork, he said without preamble. Mark sighed audibly. You're really going through with this, aren't you? I am, Jonathan said, and I need you to be on board. I'll do what I can, Mark replied. But you know this isn't going to be easy, right? The system doesn't just hand kids over to single men, no matter how much money they have. I'm not looking for easy, Jonathan said. I'm looking for what's right. Mark was silent for a moment, then said, all right, I'll get started. But don't say I didn't warn you. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of meetings, forms, and visits to lawyers and social workers. Jonathan threw himself into the process with a determination he hadn't felt in years. Each step brought him closer to giving Sarah the stability she needed, but it also brought challenges, questions about his qualifications, his motives, his ability to provide not just financially but emotionally. Through it all, Sarah remained cautious. She didn't reject him, but she didn't fully embrace him either. Jonathan understood her hesitation. Trust, he knew, was something that had to be earned. One evening, as they sat together at the shelter, Sarah asked, what happens if it doesn't work? Jonathan met her gaze. It will work, he said, because I'm not giving up. Sarah studied him for a long moment, then nodded. Okay, she said quietly. It wasn't a declaration of trust, but it was a start. And for Jonathan, that was enough. Jonathan arrived at the lawyer's office on a cold January morning, the city buzzing with life around him. The air inside the office was warm but sterile, the smell of coffee lingering faintly. Jonathan adjusted his coat and waited as the lawyer, a middle-aged man named Robert Cartwright, flipped through a thick stack of papers. So, Robert said, glancing at Jonathan over the rim of his glasses, you're serious about adopting this girl, Sarah Jenkins? Yes, Jonathan replied without hesitation. Robert set the papers down, leaning back in his chair. You're a single man, with no prior experience raising children, and a demanding job that keeps you busy most of the time. The court's going to ask a lot of questions, Jonathan. They don't hand out adoptions easily. I know that, Jonathan said, but I'm prepared to do whatever it takes. Robert nodded slowly. All right, the first hurdle is the state's requirements. They'll want to see evidence that you can provide a stable home, financially, emotionally, and practically. Your wealth will cover the financial part, but the emotional and practical sides, that's where they'll push. Jonathan frowned. What does that mean? It means they'll want to know you have a support system, Robert explained. People who can step in if something happens. And they'll want to know you've taken the time to understand what it means to raise a child, not just the big picture, but the day-to-day responsibilities. Jonathan leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly. I can learn. I'll prove to them I'm serious. Robert offered a small smile. Good. Because this won't be quick or easy. And Sarah, she's been through a lot. They'll be looking out for her interests, not yours. I wouldn't want it any other way, Jonathan said firmly. Later that day, Jonathan returned to the shelter. Sarah was sitting near the window, watching the snow fall outside. She looked up as he approached, her expression a mix of curiosity and caution. You look stressed, she said bluntly. Jonathan smiled despite himself. Long day. Sarah tilted her head. Because of me? No, he said quickly. Because of the system. Turns out, it's harder to convince people you'll be a good dad than it is to run a billion-dollar company. Sarah smirked faintly. Makes sense. Companies don't have feelings. Jonathan chuckled. Fair point. He sat beside her, his tone turning more serious. They're going to ask me a lot of questions about you, about us. I just want you to know, whatever happens, I'm not giving up. Sarah's gaze dropped to her lap. What if they say no? Jonathan hesitated. He didn't want to lie to her, but he also didn't want to scare her. Then we'll figure out another way, he said finally. Together. Sarah nodded slowly, but the doubt lingered in her eyes. Okay. In the weeks that followed, Jonathan found himself juggling the demands of his work and the rigorous adoption process. He met with social workers, attended parenting classes, and spent as much time as he could with Sarah. Each visit to the shelter solidified his determination, but it also revealed just how much work lay ahead. One afternoon, during a scheduled home visit, the caseworker, a no-nonsense woman named Ms. Hargrove, walked through Jonathan's penthouse with a clipboard in hand. It's certainly spacious, she remarked, noting the polished floors and sleek furniture. But does it feel like a home to you? Jonathan paused. The penthouse, with its minimalist decor and sweeping views, had always been more of a statement than a sanctuary. It will, he said finally. Once Sarah's here. Miss Hargrove gave him a skeptical look. Raising a child isn't just about providing a roof over their head. It's about making them feel safe, loved, and valued. I know that, Jonathan said, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make sure Sarah has that. Miss Hargrove jotted something down on her clipboard. We'll see. The court will want a thorough report, and Sarah's input will weigh heavily in their decision. If she's not fully comfortable with this, it won't go forward. Jonathan's stomach twisted at her words. He couldn't force Sarah to trust him, and he wouldn't. But the idea that her hesitation could derail everything gnawed at him. Back at the shelter, Jonathan found Sarah sitting with a group of younger kids, helping them color in a set of donated books. She looked up when he approached, her expression brightening slightly. You're early, she said, setting down a crayon. Wanted to see you, Jonathan replied, sitting across from her. How's it going? Sarah shrugged. Okay. These kids are messy, though. She gestured at the pile of crayons scattered across the table. Jonathan chuckled. Messy's part of the deal. Sarah gave him a skeptical look. You ready for that? He met her gaze. I'm ready for anything. She studied him for a moment, then said, Good, because I'm not exactly easy. Jonathan smiled. Neither am I. Guess we'll figure it out together. The adoption process hit its first major roadblock a week later. Jonathan was called into a meeting with Ms. Hargrove and a court-appointed psychologist who expressed concerns about his ability to provide the emotional support Sarah needed. You're clearly committed, the psychologist said, but commitment isn't always enough. Sarah has experienced significant trauma, and her trust in adults has been damaged. Are you prepared to navigate that? Yes, Jonathan said without hesitation. I know it won't be easy, but I'm not walking away. The psychologist nodded, but her expression remained cautious. We'll need to see consistent evidence of that. Building trust with Sarah will take time, and the court will want to see that you've established a stable, healthy bond before moving forward. Jonathan left the meeting feeling both determined and uneasy. The weight of responsibility was heavier than he'd anticipated, but it only strengthened his resolve. Sarah needed him, and he wasn't going to let her down. One evening, as they sat together in the shelter's common room, Sarah asked, Are they making it hard for you? Jonathan glanced at her, surprised by her perceptiveness. A little, he admitted, but that's their job. They want to make sure you're safe. Sarah frowned. I don't need them to keep me safe. I can do that myself. You shouldn't have to, Jonathan said gently. That's what family's for. Sarah looked at him for a long moment, then said, I hope you're right. Jonathan sat in yet another conference room, this one draped in the muted beige tones that seemed standard for family court proceedings. Across from him sat Miss Hargrove and the court-appointed psychologist, their expressions unreadable as they shuffled papers. It was a review meeting to determine the next steps in his application to adopt Sarah. The stakes felt higher than ever, and he could sense the tension in the air. Mr. Miller, Miss Hargrove began, her tone measured. We've reviewed your case thoroughly. While we acknowledge your dedication to Sarah, there are still concerns. Concerns? Jonathan leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. I've been meeting every requirement you've set. I've attended every session, completed every evaluation. What more do you need? The psychologist interjected, her voice softer but no less pointed. It's not just about completing tasks. Sarah's well-being is our priority. She's been through immense trauma, and while you've built a good rapport with her, the question is whether you're fully equipped to handle her emotional needs long-term. We've seen cases like this before, where well-meaning individuals underestimate the challenges. Jonathan's jaw tightened, but he forced himself to remain composed. I understand this isn't just about me proving I'm capable. It's about making sure Sarah feels safe and supported. That's exactly what I'm trying to do. Miss Hargrove exchanged a glance with the psychologist, then looked back at him. We're not saying no, Mr. Miller, but the court will need more evidence of your bond with Sarah. That's going to take time. Later that evening, Jonathan returned to the shelter. The frustration from the meeting clung to him like a weight, but he forced himself to shake it off as he walked through the familiar doors. He wasn't here for himself. He was here for Sarah. He found her in the common room, sitting cross-legged on the floor with a stack of paper and a handful of markers. She was drawing, her brow furrowed in concentration. As he approached, she looked up, her expression brightening slightly. "You're late," she said, smirking. "Had some stuff to take care of," Jonathan replied, sitting down beside her. "What are you working on?" Sarah held up a piece of paper. It was a crude but colorful drawing of a house with a large tree in the yard. Two stick figures stood in front of the house, one tall, one small. "It's a house," she explained. "Our house." Jonathan felt his chest tighten. "Our house, huh?" Sarah shrugged, her tone casual. "Figured we'd need one eventually. If, this works out." Jonathan swallowed hard, the emotion catching him off guard. "It's a good house," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "I like it." Sarah studied him for a moment, then said, "You look tired." He chuckled. "I've had a long day." "Because of me?" she asked, her tone tinged with guilt. "Never because of you," Jonathan said firmly. "You're the best part of my day, Sarah." Her eyes flickered with something he couldn't quite place. Relief, maybe, or something deeper. She nodded and went back to her drawing. Over the next few weeks, Jonathan focused on strengthening his bond with Sarah. They spent hours together, talking, laughing, and building the kind of connection he hoped would convince the court that they belonged together. But no matter how much progress they made, he couldn't shake the feeling that time was working against them. One afternoon, while they were sitting in the shelter's small library, Sarah asked a question that caught him off guard. "What happens if they don't let you keep me?" Jonathan looked up from the book he'd been pretending to read. "Why would you ask that?" Sarah shrugged, not meeting his gaze. "Because they're always watching, and they never let anyone stay." Jonathan set the book down and leaned closer. "Sarah, listen to me. I'm not going anywhere. No matter what happens, I'm going to fight for you. You're not alone in this." She glanced at him, her expression skeptical but softening. "You always say that." "Because it's true," Jonathan said. "And one day you'll believe it." Despite his resolve, the process dragged on. Every new meeting brought fresh challenges, and Jonathan began to feel the strain of balancing his work and his commitment to Sarah. He'd taken to working late into the night, poring over documents and attending virtual calls after spending his evenings at the shelter. It was exhausting, but he refused to let it deter him. One night, as he sat at his kitchen table surrounded by stacks of papers, his phone buzzed. It was Mark. "Got some news," Mark said when Jonathan answered. "I dug deeper into Angela Jenkins's financial records, like you asked." "And?" Jonathan prompted, already bracing himself. "There's something odd," Mark said. "In the months leading up to her death, she received a series of large cash deposits. No clear source, no accompanying records. It's like someone was helping her under the table." Jonathan frowned. "How much are we talking?" "Enough to cover most of her medical bills," Mark replied. "But there's no way to trace it. Whoever sent that money made sure to stay anonymous." Jonathan leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. "What does that mean for Sarah?" "It doesn't change anything legally," Mark said. "But it's worth noting. Someone cared enough to help Angela, even if they stayed in the shadows." Jonathan stared at the papers in front of him, the weight of the discovery settling over him. He didn't know who had stepped in to help Angela, but their actions had given Sarah a chance. And now, it was up to him to make sure that chance wasn't wasted. The next time Jonathan visited the shelter, he brought the drawing Sarah had made of their house. He'd had it framed, the simple image now protected behind glass. "What's that?" Sarah asked as he handed it to her. "Your drawing," Jonathan said. "I thought it deserved to be preserved. It's important." Sarah stared at the frame, her fingers tracing the edges. "You really kept it?" "Of course I did," Jonathan said. "It's ours." For the first time, Sarah's smile reached her eyes. She didn't say anything, but the way she held the frame told him everything he needed to know. They weren't there yet, but they were getting closer. The day of the court hearing arrived, a date that had loomed over Jonathan like a storm cloud for weeks. The room was formal and austere, with its polished wood paneling and high ceilings. But Jonathan's focus was entirely on the small figure sitting beside him. Sarah, dressed in a simple blue dress and new shoes he'd bought her, fidgeted nervously with the hem of her sleeve. "You doing okay?" Jonathan asked softly. She nodded, but her tight grip on the fabric betrayed her nerves. "Yeah, I just don't like this." "Me neither," Jonathan admitted, "but we'll get through it together." Sarah gave him a hesitant smile before a stern-looking woman entered the courtroom and took her place at the front. Judge Marilyn Carter was known for her no-nonsense approach to family court cases. Her sharp gaze swept over the room, landing briefly on Jonathan and Sarah before she began. "We're here to review the petition of Mr. Jonathan Miller for the adoption of Sarah Jenkins," the judge announced. "This is a serious matter, and I want to ensure we approach it with the gravity it deserves. Let's begin." The next hour was a blur of testimony, paperwork, and pointed questions. Ms. Hargrove presented her report, detailing Jonathan's qualifications, his efforts to connect with Sarah, and the potential challenges of their situation. The court-appointed psychologist echoed some of these points, emphasizing Sarah's trauma and the need for a stable, long-term commitment. Jonathan listened intently, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. When it was his turn to speak, he stood and faced the judge with as much confidence as he could muster. "Your Honor," he began, "I know I'm not the most conventional candidate for adoption. I'm not married, and I've never raised a child before. But what I lack in experience, I make up for in commitment. Sarah is an incredible kid, and she deserves a chance to thrive. I can give her that." Judge Carter raised an eyebrow. "Mr. Miller, you've built a successful career, but parenting isn't about success. It's about sacrifice. How do you intend to balance the demands of your work with the needs of a child?" "I've already started restructuring my schedule," Jonathan replied. "I've delegated more responsibilities at work to ensure I can be there for Sarah." "This isn't something I'm taking lightly." The judge nodded, her expression neutral. "And what about Sarah's perspective? Have you discussed this with her?" "Yes, Your Honor," Jonathan said. "And I believe she'll tell you herself how she feels." Judge Carter turned to Sarah, her expression softening slightly. "Sarah, would you like to say anything?" Sarah hesitated, her hands twisting in her lap. Jonathan gave her a reassuring nod, and she slowly stood. "I don't like talking in front of people," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "But I want to say that Mr. Miller is different. He shows up. He listens. He cares. I don't trust people very easily, but I trust him." Her words hung in the air, and Jonathan felt a surge of pride and emotion he hadn't expected. Sarah sat down quickly, her face flushed, but she didn't let go of Jonathan's hand. The hearing dragged on, with the judge asking more questions and reviewing additional reports. At one point, the attorney representing the state raised concerns about Jonathan's inexperience and the potential risks of placing Sarah with a single parent. "While Mr. Miller has demonstrated dedication, we can't ignore the fact that this is a high-risk situation," the attorney argued. "Sarah has already experienced significant instability. A failed placement could be devastating." Jonathan's chest tightened, but he forced himself to stay calm. "Your Honor," he interjected, "I understand the concerns, but I'm not going to fail her. I've seen what happens when people walk away, and I refuse to be one of those people. I'm here for the long haul." Judge Carter regarded him carefully, then glanced back at her notes. "Thank you, Mr. Miller. We'll take a short recess before I make my decision." As the judge exited the courtroom, Jonathan turned to Sarah. "You okay?" She nodded, though her grip on his hand hadn't loosened. "Do you think she'll say yes?" Jonathan hesitated. He didn't want to give her false hope, but he also didn't want to let her down. "I think we've done everything we can. Now we just have to wait." The room was tense when Judge Carter returned, her face unreadable as she took her seat. She shuffled her papers before looking up. After careful consideration, I've come to a decision, she began. This case is unusual, and it presents unique challenges. However, it's clear to me that Mr. Miller is deeply committed to Sarah's well-being. He has demonstrated a willingness to adapt, learn, and make sacrifices to ensure her happiness and stability. Jonathan's heart pounded in his chest as he held his breath. Therefore, the judge continued, I am granting the petition for adoption. Congratulations, Mr. Miller. You are now officially Sarah's legal parent. The words hit Jonathan like a wave, and for a moment, he couldn't move. Then he felt Sarah's arms wrap around him, her small frame trembling against his. We did it, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Jonathan hugged her tightly, his own throat too tight to speak. When he finally pulled back, he smiled down at her. We did. Outside the courtroom, Ms. Hargrove approached them, her expression softer than Jonathan had ever seen. Congratulations, she said. You've both earned this. Thank you, Jonathan replied, for everything. As they walked out into the crisp winter air, Sarah glanced up at him. So, does this mean I'm stuck with you now? Jonathan laughed, ruffling her hair. Pretty much. Good, she said with a small smile. Because I was starting to get used to you. Jonathan smiled back, his heart full in a way he hadn't felt in years. For the first time, he realized he wasn't just giving Sarah a family, she was giving him one, too. The first night Sarah spent at Jonathan's penthouse was quiet, but charged with unspoken emotions. She wandered through the expansive space, her small steps echoing faintly against the polished floors. It was nothing like the cramped shelter she had called home for so long. Jonathan watched her carefully, unsure if the silence was a sign of awe, discomfort, or something else entirely. You okay? He finally asked, breaking the quiet. Sarah shrugged, running her fingers over the back of a sleek leather couch. This place is big. Jonathan smiled. Yeah, it's probably a little overwhelming at first. She nodded, but her gaze remained distant. I'm not used to stuff like this. Feels like I shouldn't touch anything. Jonathan's chest tightened. Sarah, this is your home now. You can touch anything you want. Scratch that. You can do anything you want. Well, within reason, he added with a small laugh. Sarah smiled faintly but didn't reply. Jonathan decided not to push. She needed time to adjust, and he was determined to give her as much as she needed. The next morning, Jonathan woke up early and started making breakfast. Cooking wasn't exactly his strong suit, but he managed to fry some eggs and toast without setting off the smoke alarm. By the time Sarah shuffled into the kitchen, her hair messy and her expression groggy, he had 2 plates waiting on the counter. Morning, he said cheerfully. I made breakfast. Sarah eyed the food skeptically before sitting down. You cooked? Hey, I'm not completely useless, Jonathan joked. I might not be a 5-star chef, but I can handle the basics. Sarah poked at the eggs with her fork. It's not bad, she admitted after a bite. Jonathan grinned. I'll take that as high praise. As they ate, he tried to make conversation, asking her about her favorite foods and what she wanted to do that day. Sarah answered in short sentences, but she seemed to relax a little with each passing moment. After breakfast, Jonathan decided to take Sarah shopping. Her belongings from the shelter fit into a single bag, and he wanted her to have things that felt truly hers. They started at a department store, where Sarah picked out clothes with quiet but decisive confidence. Jonathan let her take the lead, only stepping in to remind her to grab a warm coat and proper shoes for the winter. From there, they moved to a toy store, where Sarah hesitated, her eyes lingering on a display of art supplies. You like drawing, right? Jonathan asked. Sarah nodded slowly. Yeah, but I don't need. Grab whatever you want, Jonathan interrupted. This isn't about what you need. It's about what makes you happy. For the first time, Sarah's face lit up with genuine excitement. She picked out a sketch pad, markers, and a set of colored pencils, clutching them to her chest as if they were treasures. Jonathan felt a swell of pride watching her, knowing he was helping her take the first steps toward building a life she could call her own. That evening, as they settled in at home, Jonathan noticed Sarah sitting at the kitchen table, sketching intently. He walked over and saw that she was drawing a house. Not the grand penthouse they were in, but a small, cozy house with a yard and a tree. Nice work, he said, pulling out a chair to sit beside her. Is that the same house from your other drawing? Yeah. Sarah replied without looking up. It's what I always pictured when I thought about having a home. Jonathan hesitated, then said, You know, we could make this place feel more like that. Add some plants, maybe hang up some of your drawings. Whatever you want. Sarah finally looked up, her expression thoughtful. Really? Of course, Jonathan said. This is your home too. You should feel like it's yours. Sarah nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. Okay. The days that followed were a whirlwind of adjustments. Jonathan quickly learned that parenting was both rewarding and challenging. Sarah was fiercely independent, but there were moments when her vulnerability peeked through, reminding him just how much she had endured. One evening, as they were unpacking the last of her new things, Sarah asked, Why do you want to do all this for me? Jonathan paused, caught off guard by the question. Because you're worth it, he said simply. You deserve to have someone in your corner. Someone who cares. Sarah studied him for a moment, then said, No one's ever said that to me before. Jonathan's heart ached at her words. Well, get used to it, because I'm going to keep saying it. As winter turned to spring, their bond grew stronger. They fell into a routine. School for Sarah, work for Jonathan, and evenings spent together cooking or trying to, playing games and working on Sarah's latest sketches. The penthouse began to change too, with Sarah's art adorning the walls and small touches of warmth appearing in every room. One weekend, Jonathan surprised Sarah by taking her to a park in the suburbs. She lit up when she saw the open fields and towering trees, her laughter echoing as she chased a kite he had brought. Watching her run, carefree and joyful, Jonathan felt something he hadn't felt in years: contentment. As they sat under a tree, sharing sandwiches from a nearby deli, Sarah turned to him and said, I like this. What? The park? Jonathan asked. No, she said. Us. Jonathan smiled, his throat tightening. Me too, kid. Me too. That night, as Sarah got ready for bed, Jonathan tucked her in, a new ritual she had shyly requested a few weeks earlier. Good night, Sarah, he said softly. Good night, she replied, then hesitated. Jonathan? Yeah. She looked at him, her expression uncertain. Thanks. For everything. Jonathan leaned down and kissed the top of her head, something he hadn't done before but felt natural now. You don't have to thank me. I'm the lucky one. As he turned off the light and closed the door, Jonathan realized that for the first time in years, he truly felt at home. And it wasn't because of the penthouse, the city, or even his success. It was because of Sarah. Spring had brought warmer days and a sense of calm to Sarah and Jonathan's new life together. They had fallen into a rhythm that felt almost natural. School runs, shared meals, evenings spent watching movies or working on Sarah's art projects. Yet beneath the surface, Jonathan knew there were still cracks in the foundation. Trust didn't grow overnight, and Sarah's past continued to cast long shadows. The first sign of trouble came on a quiet Thursday afternoon. Jonathan had stepped out for a late meeting, leaving Sarah with their trusted housekeeper, Evelyn. By the time he returned, the penthouse was unusually quiet. Sarah? Jonathan called, setting his briefcase down. No response. Evelyn appeared from the kitchen, her expression uneasy. She went out about an hour ago, she said. Said she wanted to take a walk. Jonathan frowned. Alone? She insisted she was fine. I thought it would be okay, Evelyn said apologetically. Jonathan's heart sank. He had made it clear that Sarah wasn't to wander off alone. Not yet. She was still learning to navigate her new world, and the thought of her out there, unprotected, made his chest tighten. Grabbing his coat, he headed for the elevator, hoping she hadn't gone far. Jonathan found Sarah in a small park a few blocks away, sitting on a bench with her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She didn't look surprised when he approached, but her expression was guarded. Hey, Jonathan said, sitting beside her. Evelyn told me you went for a walk. You know, we talked about this. I just needed some air, Sarah replied, her voice defensive. I get that, Jonathan said, keeping his tone calm. But you can't just take off without telling me. I was worried. Sarah shrugged, her gaze fixed on the ground. I didn't mean to make you worry. Jonathan studied her for a moment, trying to gauge what was really going on. Sarah, is something bothering you? She hesitated, then muttered, I don't know. It's just weird. What's weird? This, she said, gesturing vaguely. Living here, being part of this. It doesn't feel real. Jonathan's chest tightened. It's real, Sarah. I know it's a big change, but this is your home now. I'm not going anywhere. Sarah didn't reply, but the look in her eyes told him she wasn't convinced. The tension lingered over the next few days. Sarah grew quieter, more withdrawn, and Jonathan struggled to reach her. He sensed she was testing him, waiting to see if his patience would wear thin. It was a pattern he'd read about in the parenting books Miss Hargrove had recommended, but knowing about it didn't make it easier to handle. The breaking point came one Saturday morning when Jonathan asked Sarah to clean up her art supplies, which had taken over the dining table. She rolled her eyes and muttered something under her breath, but when he repeated the request, her frustration boiled over. "Why do you care?" she snapped, shoving the supplies into a messy pile. "It's not like this place isn't already perfect." Jonathan took a deep breath, keeping his voice steady. "Sarah, I'm not asking you to be perfect. I'm asking you to take care of your things." "Why?" she demanded, her voice rising. "What's the point? You'll probably get tired of me and send me back anyway." The words hit Jonathan like a punch to the gut. He crouched down, meeting her gaze. "Sarah, look at me," he said firmly. She hesitated, then met his eyes, her own filled with anger and fear. "I'm not sending you back," Jonathan said, his voice unwavering. "No matter what. You're stuck with me, kid. You can get mad, you can yell, you can test me all you want, but I'm not going anywhere." Sarah's lip trembled, and for a moment, Jonathan thought she might lash out again. But then she dropped her gaze, her shoulders slumping. "I just don't want to mess this up." "You're not going to mess this up," Jonathan said gently. "We're figuring this out together, and I know it's not easy, but you don't have to do it alone." Later that evening, Sarah approached Jonathan as he sat on the couch, going over some work emails. She hovered awkwardly for a moment before sitting beside him. "Can we talk?" she asked quietly. Jonathan closed his laptop. "Always," Sarah hesitated, picking at a loose thread on her sleeve. "I don't mean to be difficult," she said. It's hard to believe this is real. Every time something good happens, it feels like it's just going to go away." Jonathan's heart ached at her words. "I get it," he said. "After everything you've been through, it makes sense that you'd feel that way. But Sarah, this isn't temporary. I'm not temporary. We're in this for the long haul." She nodded slowly, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Okay." Jonathan reached out, resting a hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to have it all figured out right now. We'll take it one day at a time." Sarah leaned against him, her small frame trembling slightly. "Thanks," she murmured. "For what?" Jonathan asked. "For not giving up," she said. Jonathan smiled, his throat tight. "Never." The following weeks brought a noticeable shift. Sarah began to open up more, sharing stories about her mom, her time at the shelter, and even some of her fears. Jonathan listened patiently, offering reassurance where he could, and simply being present when words weren't enough. One evening, as they were watching a movie, Sarah turned to him and said, "You know, I think I believe you now." Jonathan frowned, unsure of what she meant. "Believe me about what?" "That you're not going anywhere," she said, her tone matter-of-fact but tinged with vulnerability. Jonathan felt a lump rise in his throat. "Good," he said softly. "Because I'm not." Sarah nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. "Good." That night, as Jonathan tucked Sarah in, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. The road ahead wouldn't be without challenges, but for the first time, he felt like they were truly in this together. And that, he realized, was all that mattered. The seasons turned, and before Jonathan realized it, a year had passed since Sarah entered his life. The penthouse, once sleek and impersonal, now felt alive. Sarah's drawings adorned the walls, her laughter echoed through the halls, and the once pristine furniture bore the marks of a life well lived. A scuff here, a crayon mark there. For the first time in years, Jonathan felt like his home was truly a home. With Christmas approaching, Jonathan wanted to make it special. Sarah had never experienced a real family Christmas, and he was determined to change that. He took her shopping for decorations, letting her choose a tree taller than either of them expected to fit in the penthouse. They spent an entire afternoon untangling lights, hanging ornaments, and arguing over where to place the star. "Higher," Sarah instructed, pointing to the very top of the tree. "I can't reach higher unless I grow another foot," Jonathan grumbled, standing on a step stool with the star in hand. Sarah smirked, holding the ladder steady. You're tall enough for everything else. Stop complaining. When the star was finally in place, they stepped back to admire their work. The tree sparkled, its glow filling the room with warmth. Sarah crossed her arms and nodded, satisfied. It's perfect. Jonathan glanced at her, smiling. Yeah, it is. On Christmas morning, Jonathan woke early to the smell of cinnamon rolls baking. Sarah had insisted on helping Evelyn prepare breakfast, and by the time he made his way to the kitchen, the table was already set. Sarah wore an apron that was too big for her hair messy from sleep, but her face alight with excitement. Merry Christmas, she said, bouncing slightly on her heels. Merry Christmas, kid, Jonathan replied, ruffling her hair. You've been busy, Sarah shrugged, trying to hide her grin. Evelyn did most of it. Evelyn raised an eyebrow from across the room. She did more than she's letting on, she said. Kept sneaking tastes of the frosting, too, Sarah giggled. But Jonathan could see the pride in her expression. She was thriving, and it filled him with a quiet joy he couldn't put into words. After breakfast, they moved to the living room, where the tree stood surrounded by a small pile of gifts. Sarah's eyes widened as she took in the sight, her fingers brushing over the wrapping paper like it was something precious. You didn't have to do all this, she said softly. Jonathan crouched beside her. I didn't have to, but I wanted to. This is your first real Christmas, Sarah. You deserve it. She nodded, her voice catching as she said, thanks. They spent the next hour unwrapping gifts. Sarah squealed with delight at the art supplies Jonathan had gotten her, a new jacket she'd been eyeing, and a collection of books she'd mentioned in passing. But it was the last gift that made her pause, a small box with a handwritten note attached. Sarah opened the note first, her brows furrowing as she read aloud, to Sarah, for all the adventures we'll share. Inside the box was a silver locket, engraved with a simple tree, a symbol they had both come to associate with the life they were building together. Sarah held it in her hands, her eyes shining. It's beautiful, she whispered. Open it, Jonathan said, his voice gentle. Sarah did, revealing a tiny photo inside, one of her and Jonathan, taken at the park during the spring. She stared at it for a long moment before looking up at him. Thank you, she said, her voice thick with emotion. Jonathan wrapped an arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. You're welcome. Merry Christmas, Sarah. That evening, after the excitement had settled, Sarah sat at the table with her sketchpad, working on a new drawing. Jonathan joined her, a cup of coffee in hand. What are you working on now? He asked. Sarah tilted the pad so he could see. It was a drawing of their Christmas tree, but instead of the penthouse in the background, she'd drawn the cozy house she'd always imagined, a small home with a yard and a big tree outside. I like the penthouse, she said quickly, as if worried he might take it the wrong way. But this is still what I think of when I picture home. Jonathan nodded, an idea forming in the back of his mind. It's a beautiful picture, he said, and who knows, maybe one day we'll have a house like that. Sarah's eyes lit up. Really, Jonathan said. Wherever we end up, we'll make it ours. That's what matters. Sarah smiled, her expression thoughtful. I like that. As the night wound down, Jonathan tucked Sarah into bed, a ritual that had become second nature to both of them. She yawned, pulling the blankets up to her chin as she looked at him. Do you think my mom would be happy? She asked suddenly. Jonathan blinked, caught off guard by the question. I think she'd be proud, he said after a moment. She'd be proud of you, and I hope she'd think I'm doing okay. Sarah nodded, her eyes heavy with sleep. She'd like you, she murmured. She always said families should stick together. Jonathan's throat tightened, but he managed a soft smile. She was right. As Sarah drifted off, Jonathan sat by her bedside for a while, watching her breathe. The past year had been full of challenges, but in that quiet moment, he felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. Sarah had given him more than he'd ever expected, a sense of purpose, a reason to hope, and a family he hadn't realized he needed. The next morning, the world outside their windows was blanketed in snow, fresh and untouched. As Sarah and Jonathan stood together by the window, sipping hot chocolate and watching the city wake up, he turned to her. Ready to make some snow angels? He asked. Sarah grinned, already pulling on her coat. Let's do it. And for the first time in years, Jonathan felt like the future wasn't just something to endure. It was something to look forward to, one day at a time.